Chapter 12 of My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adina Owen. My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 12. I am ashamed to say what feeling became strongest in my mind about this time. Next to the sympathy we all of us felt for my dear lady in her deep sorrow, for that was greater and stronger than anything else, however contradictory you may think it when you hear all. It might arise from my being so far from well at the time, which produced a diseased mind and a diseased body, but I was absolutely jealous for my father's memory when I saw how many signs of grief there were for my lord's death, he having done next to nothing for the village and parish, which now changed, as it were, its daily course of life because his lordship died in a far-off city. My father had spent the best years of his manhood in laboring hard, body and soul, for the people amongst whom he lived. His family, of course, claimed the first place in his heart. He would have been good for little, even in the way of benevolence, if they had not. But close after them he cared for his parishioners and neighbors, and yet, when he died, though the church bells tolled and smote upon our hearts with hard, fresh pain at every beat, the sounds of everyday life still went on, close pressing around us. Carts and carriages, street cries, distant barrel organs, the kindly neighbors kept them out of our street. Life, active, noisy life, pressed on our acute consciousness of death and jarred upon it as on a quick nerve. And when we went to church, my father's own church, though the pulpit cushions were black, and many of the congregation had put on some humble sign of mourning, yet it did not alter the whole material aspect of the place. And yet, what was Lord Ludlow's relation to Hanbury compared to my father's work and place and... Oh, it was very wicked in me. I think if I had seen my lady, if I had dared to ask to go to her, I should not have felt so miserable, so discontented. But she sat in her own room, hung with black all, even over the shutters. She saw no light but that which was artificial, candles, lamps, and the like, for more than a month. Only Adams went near her. Mr. Gray was not admitted, though he called daily. Even Mrs. Medlicott did not see her for near a fortnight. The sight of my lady's griefs, or rather the recollection of it, made Mrs. Medlicott talk far more than was her wont. She told us with many tears and much gesticulation, even speaking German at times, when her English would not flow, that my lady sat there, a white figure in the middle of the darkened room, a shaded lamp near her, the light of which fell on an open Bible, the great family Bible. It was not open to any chapter or consoling verse, but at the page whereon were registered the births of her 9 children. 5 had died in infancy, sacrificed to the cruel system which forbade the mother to suckle her babies. 4 had lived longer. Urian had been the first to die. Ughtred Mortimer, Earl Ludlow, the last. My lady did not cry, Mrs. Medlicott said. She was quite composed, very still, very silent. She put aside everything that savoured of mere business, sent people to Mr. Horner for that. But she was proudly alive to every possible form which might do honour to the last of her race. In those days, expresses were slow things, and forms still slower. Before my lady's directions could reach Vienna, my lord was buried. Then there was some talk, so Mrs. Medlicott said, about taking the body up and bringing him to Hanbury. But his executors, connections to the Ludlow side, demurred to this. If he were removed to England, he must be carried on to Scotland and interred with his monk-shaven forefathers. My lady, deeply hurt, withdrew from the discussion before it degenerated to an unseemly contest. But all the more, for this understood mortification of my lady's, did the whole village and estate of Hanbury assume every outward sign of mourning. The church bells tolled morning and evening. The church itself was draped in black inside. Hatchments were placed everywhere where hatchments could be put. All the tenantry spoke in hushed voices for more than a week, scarcely daring to observe that all flesh, even that of an Earl Ludlow, and the last of the Hanburys, was but grass after all. The very Fighting Lion closed its front door. Front shutters it had none, and those who needed drink stole in at the back, and were silent and maudlin over their cups, instead of riotous and noisy. Miss Galindo's eyes were swollen up with crying, and she told me with a fresh burst of tears that even humpbacked Sally had been found sobbing over her Bible, and using a pocket handkerchief for the first time in her life, her aprons having hitherto stood her in the necessary stead, but not being sufficiently in accordance with etiquette to be used when mourning over an earl's premature decease. If it was this way out of the hall, you might work it by the rule of three, as Miss Galindo used to say, and judge what it was in the hall. We none of us spoke but in a whisper. We tried not to eat, and indeed the shock had been so really great, and we did really care so much for my lady, that for some days we had but little appetite. But after that I fear our sympathy grew weaker, while our flesh grew stronger. But we still spoke low, and our hearts ached whenever we thought of my lady sitting there alone in the darkened room, with the light ever falling on that one solemn page. We wished, oh, how I wished, that she would see Mr. Gray, but Adams said she thought my lady ought to have a bishop come to see her. Still no one had authority enough to send for one. Mr. Horner all this time was suffering as much as anyone. He was too faithful a servant of the great Hanbury family, though now the family had dwindled down to a fragile old lady, not to mourn acutely over its probable extinction. He had, besides, a deeper sympathy and reverence with and for my lady in all things than probably he cared ever to show, for his manners were always measured and cold. He suffered from sorrow. He also suffered from wrong. My lord's executors kept writing to him continually. My lady refused to listen to mere business, saying she entrusted all to him, but the all was more complicated than I ever thoroughly understood. As far as I comprehended the case, it was something of this kind. There had been a mortgage raised on my lady's property of Hanbury, to enable my lord, her husband, to spend money in cultivating his Scotch estates, after some new fashion that required capital. As long as my lord her son lived, who was to succeed both the estates after her death, this did not signify. So she had said and felt, and she had refused to take any steps to secure the repayment of capital, or even the payment of the interest of the mortgage, from the possible representatives and possessors of the Scotch estates to the possible owner of the Hanbury property, saying it ill became her to calculate on the contingency of her son's death. But he had died childless, unmarried. The heir of Monkshaven property was an Edinburgh advocate, a far-away kinsman of my lord's. The Hanbury property, at my lady's death, would go to the descendants of a third son of the Squire Hanbury in the days of Queen Anne. This complication of affairs was most grievous to Mr. Horner. He had always been opposed to the mortgage, had hated the payment of the interest, as obliging my lady to practice certain economies which, though she took care to make them as personal as possible, he disliked as derogatory to the family. Poor Mr. Horner! He was so cold and hard in his manner, so curt and decisive in his speech, that I don't think we any of us did him justice. Miss Galindo was almost the first at this time to speak a kind word of him, or to take thought of him at all, any farther than to get out of his way when we saw him approaching. "I don't think Mr. Horner is well," she said one day, about 3 weeks after we had heard of my lord's death. "He sits resting his head on his hands, and hardly hears me when I speak to him." But I thought no more of it, as Miss Galindo did not name it again. My lady came amongst us once more. From elderly she had become old, a little, frail old lady, in heavy black drapery, never speaking about nor alluding to her great sorrow, quieter, gentler, paler than ever before, and her eyes dim with much weeping, never witnessed by mortal. She had seen Mr. Gray at the expiration of the month of deep retirement, but I do not think that even to him she had said one word of her own particular individual sorrow. All mention of it seemed to be buried deep for evermore. One day Mr. Horner sent word that he was too much indisposed to attend to his usual business at the Hall, but he wrote down some directions and requests to Miss Galindo, saying that he would be at his office early the next morning. The next morning he was dead. Miss Galindo told my lady. Miss Galindo herself cried plentifully, but my lady, although very much distressed, could not cry. It seemed a physical impossibility, as if she had shed all the tears in her power. Moreover, I almost think her wonder was far greater that she herself lived than that Mr. Horner died. It was almost natural that so faithful a servant should break his heart when the family he belonged to lost their stay, their heir, and their last hope. Yes, Mr. Horner was a faithful servant. I do not think there are so many faithful now, but perhaps that is an old woman's fancy of mine. When his will came to be examined, it was discovered that soon after Harry Gregson's accident Mr. Horner had left the few thousands, 3 I think, of which he was possessed, in trust for Harry's benefit, desiring his executors to see that the lad was well educated in certain things for which Mr. Horner had thought that he had shown a special aptitude. And there was a kind of implied apology to my lady in one sentence where he stated that Harry's lameness would prevent his being ever able to gain his living by the exercise of any mere bodily faculties, as had been wished by a lady whose wishes he, the testator, was bound to regard. But there was a codicil in the will, dated since Lord Ludlow's death, feebly written by Mr. Horner himself, as if in preparation only for some more formal manner of bequest, or perhaps only as a mere temporary arrangement till he could see a lawyer, and have a fresh will made. In this he revoked his previous bequest to Harry Gregson. He only left £200 to Mr. Gray to be used, as the gentleman thought best, for Henry Gregson's benefit. With this one exception, he bequeathed all the rest of his savings to my lady, with a hope that they might form a nest egg, as it were, toward paying off the mortgage which had been such a grief to him during his life. I may not repeat all this in lawyer's phrase. I heard it through Miss Galindo, and she might make mistakes, though indeed she was very clear-headed, and soon earned the respect of Mr. Smithson, the lady's lawyer from Warwick. Mr. Smithson knew Miss Galindo a little before, both personally and by reputation, but I don't think he was prepared to find her installed as steward's clerk, and at first he was inclined to treat her in this capacity with polite contempt. But Miss Galindo was both a lady and a spirited, sensible woman, and she could put aside her self-indulgence and eccentricity of speech and manner whenever she chose. Nay, more, she was usually so talkative that if she had not been amusing and warm-hearted, one might have thought her wearisome occasionally. But to meet Mr. Smithson she came out daily in her Sunday gown. She said no more than was required in answer to his questions. Her books and papers were in thorough order and methodically kept, her statements of matters of fact accurate and to be relied upon. She was amusingly conscious of her victory over his contempt of a woman clerk and his preconceived opinion of her unpractical eccentricity. "Let me alone," she said one day when she came in to sit a while with me. "That man is a good man, a sensible man, and I have no doubt he is a good lawyer, but he can't fathom women yet. I make no doubt he'll go back to Warwick, and never give me credit again to those people who made him think me half-cracked to begin with. Oh, my dear, he did. He showed it 20 times worse than my poor dear master ever did. It was a form to be gone through to please my lady, and for her sake he would hear my statements and see my books. It was keeping a woman out of harm's way, at any rate, to let her fancy herself useful. I read the man, and I am thankful to say he cannot read me. At least, only one side of me. When I see an end to be gained, I can behave myself accordingly. Here was a man who thought that a woman in a black silk gown was a respectable, orderly kind of person, and I was a woman in a black silk gown. He believed that a woman could not write straight lines, and required a man to tell her that 2 and 2 made 4. I was not above ruling my books, and had Cocker a little more at my fingers' ends than he had. But my greatest triumph has been holding my tongue. He would have thought nothing of my books, or my sums, or my black silk gown, if I had spoken unasked. So I have buried more sense in my bosom these 10 days than ever I have uttered in the whole course of my life before. I have been so curt, so abrupt, so abominably dull, that I'll answer for it he thinks me worthy to be a man. But I must go back to him, my dear, so good-bye to conversation, and you." But though Mr. Smithson might be satisfied with Miss Galindo, I am afraid she was the only part of the affair with which he was content. Everything else went wrong. I could not say who told me so, but the conviction of this seemed to pervade the house. I never knew how much we had all looked up to the silent, gruff Mr. Horner for decisions until he was gone. My lady herself was a pretty good woman of business, as women of business go. Her father, seeing that she would be the heiress of the Hanbury property, had given her a training which was thought unusual in those days, and she liked to feel herself queen regnant, and to have to decide in all cases between herself and her tenantry. But perhaps Mr. Horner would have done it more wisely. Not but what she had always attended to him at last. She would begin by saying, pretty clearly and promptly, what she would have done and what she would not have done. If Mr. Horner approved of it, he bowed and set about obeying her directly. If he disapproved of it, he bowed and lingered so long before he obeyed her that she forced his opinion out of him with her, "Well, Mr. Horner, and what have you to say against it?" For she always understood his silence as well as if he had spoken. But the estate was pressed for ready money, and Mr. Horner had grown gloomy and languid since the death of his wife, and even his own personal affairs were not in the order in which they had been a year or two before, for his old clerk had gradually become superannuated, or at any rate unable by the superfluity of his own energy and wit to supply the spirit that was wanting in Mr. Horner. Day after day Mr. Smithson seemed to grow more fidgety, more annoyed at the state of affairs. Like every one else employed by Lady Ludlow, as far as I could learn, he had a hereditary tie to the Hanbury family. As long as the Smithsons had been lawyers, they had been lawyers to the Hanburys, always coming in on all great family occasions, and better able to understand the characters and connect the links of what had once been a large and scattered family than any individual thereof had ever been. As long as a man was at the head of the Hanburys, the lawyers had simply acted as servants, and had only given their advice when it was required. But they had assumed a different position on the memorable occasion of the mortgage. They had remonstrated against it. My lady had resented this remonstrance, and a slight, unspoken coolness had existed between her and the father of this Mr. Smithson ever since. I was very sorry for my lady. Mr. Smithson was inclined to blame Mr. Horner for the disorderly state in which he found some of the outlying farms, and for the deficiencies in the annual payment of rents. Mr. Smithson had too much good feeling to put this blame into words, but my lady's quick instinct led her to reply to a thought, the existence of which she perceived, and she quickly told the truth, and explained how she had interfered repeatedly to prevent Mr. Horner from taking certain desirable steps, which were discordant to her hereditary sense of right and wrong between landlord and tenant. She also spoke of the want of ready money as a misfortune that could be remedied by more economical personal expenditure on her own part, by which individual saving it was possible that a reduction of £50 a year might have been accomplished. But as soon as Mr. Smithson touched on larger economies, such as either affected the welfare of others or the honour and standing of the great house of Hanbury, she was inflexible. Her establishment consisted of somewhere about 40 servants, of whom nearly as many as 20 were unable to perform their work properly, and yet would have been hurt if they had been dismissed, so they had the credit of fulfilling duties while my lady paid and kept their substitutes. Mr. Smithson made a calculation, and would have saved some hundreds a year by pensioning off these old servants. But my lady would not hear of it. Then again I know privately that he urged her to allow some of us to return to our homes. Bitterly we should have regretted the separation from Lady Ludlow, but we would have gone back gladly had we known at the time that her circumstances required it. But she would not listen to the proposal for a moment. "If I cannot act justly towards everyone, I will give up a plan which has been a source of much satisfaction. At least I will not carry it out to such an extent in future. But to these young ladies, who do me the favour to live with me at present, I stand pledged I cannot go back from my word, Mr. Smithson. We had better talk no more of this." As she spoke, she entered the room where I lay. She and Mr. Smithson were coming for some papers contained in the bureau. They did not know I was there, and Mr. Smithson started a little when he saw me, as he must have been aware that I had overheard something, but my lady did not change a muscle of her face. All the world might overhear her kind, just, pure sayings, and she had no fear of their misconstruction. She came up to me and kissed me on the forehead, and then went to search for the required papers. "I rode over the Connington farms yesterday, my lady. I must say I was quite grieved to see the condition they are in. All the land that is not waste is utterly exhausted with working successive white crops, not a pinch of manure laid on the ground for years. I must say that a greater contrast could never have been presented than that between Harding's farm and the next fields. Fences in perfect order, rotation crops, sheep eating down the turnips on the wastelands, everything that could be desired. "Whose farm is that?" asked my lady. "Why, I am sorry to say it was on none of your ladyship's that I saw such good methods adopted. I hoped it was. I stopped my horse to inquire. A queer-looking man, sitting on his horse like a tailor, watching his men with a couple of the sharpest eyes I ever saw, and dropping his H's at every word, answered my question and told me it was his. I could not go on asking him who he was, but I fell into conversation with him, and gathered that he had earned some money in trade in Birmingham, and had bought the estate, 500 acres, I think he said, on which he was born, and now was setting himself to cultivate it in downright earnest, going to Holkham and Woburn and half the county over to get himself up on the subject." "It would be Brooke, that dissenting baker from Birmingham," said my lady in her most icy tone. "Mr. Smithson, I am sorry I have been detaining you so long, but I think these are the letters you wish to see." If her ladyship thought by this speech to quench Mr. Smithson, she was mistaken. Mr. Smithson just looked at the letters, and went on with the old subject. "Now, my lady, it struck me that if you had such a man to take poor Horner's place, he would work the rents and the land round most satisfactorily. I should not despair of inducing this very man to undertake the work. I should not mind speaking to him myself on this subject, for we got capital friends over a snack of luncheon that he asked me to share with him." Lady Ludlow fixed her eyes on Mr. Smithson as he spoke, and never took them off his face until he had ended. She was silent a minute before she answered. "You're very good, Mr. Smithson, but I need not trouble you with any such arrangements. I am going to write this afternoon to Captain James, a friend of one of my sons, who has, I hear, been severely wounded at Trafalgar, to request him to honor me by accepting Mr. Horner's situation." "A Captain James, a captain in the navy, going to manage her ladyship's estate?" "If you will be so kind, I shall esteem it a condescension on his part, but I hear that he will have to resign his profession. His state of health is so bad, and a country life is especially prescribed for him. I am in some hopes of tempting him here, as I learn he has but little to depend on if he gives up his profession." "A Captain James, an invalid captain?" "You think I am asking too great a favour," continued my lady. I could never tell how far it was simplicity, or how far a kind of innocent malice, that made her misinterpret Mr. Smithson's words and looks as she did. "But he is not a post-captain, only a commander, and his pension will be but small. I may be able, by offering him country air and a healthy occupation, to restore him to health."
"Occupation! My lady, may I ask how a sailor is to manage land? Why, your tenants will laugh him to scorn."
"My tenants, I trust, will not behave so ill as to laugh at any one I choose to set over them. Captain James has had experience in managing men. He has remarkable practical talents, and great common sense, as I hear from every one. But whatever he may be, the affair rests between him and myself. I can only say I shall esteem myself fortunate if he comes." There was no more to be said, after my lady spoke in this manner. I had heard her mention Captain James before, as a middy who had been very kind to her son Urian, although I thought I remembered then that she had mentioned that his family circumstances were not very prosperous. But I confess that, little as I knew of the management of land, I quite sided with Mr. Smithson. He, silently prohibited from again speaking to my lady on the subject, opened his mind to Miss Galindo, from whom I was pretty sure to hear all the opinions and news of the household and village. She had taken a great fancy to me, because she said I talked so agreeably. I believe it was because I listened so well.
"Well, have you heard the news," she began, "about this Captain James? A sailor with a wooden leg, I have no doubt. What would the poor dear deceased master have to say to it, if he had known who was to be his successor? My dear, I have often thought of the postman's bringing me a letter as one of the pleasures I shall miss in heaven. But really, I think Mr. Horner may be thankful he has got out of the reach of news, or else he would hear of Mr. Smithson's having made up to the Birmingham baker, and of his one-legged captain coming to dot and go one over the estate. I suppose he will look after the laborers through a spy-glass. I only hope he won't stick in the mud with his wooden leg, for I, for one, won't help him out. Yes, I would, she said, correcting herself. I would for my lady's sake.
But are you sure he has a wooden leg? Asked I. I heard Lady Ludlow tell Mr. Smithson about him, and she only spoke of him as wounded.
Well, sailors are almost always wounded in the leg. Look at Greenwich Hospital. I should say there were 20 one-legged pensioners to one without an arm there. But say he's got half a dozen legs. What has he to do with managing land? I shall think him very impudent if he comes, taking advantage of my lady's kind heart.
However, he did come. In a month from that time the carriage was sent to meet Captain James, just as 3 years before it had been sent to meet me. His coming had been so much talked about that we were all as curious as possible to see him, and to know how so unusual an experiment it seemed to us would answer. But before I tell you anything about our new agent, I must speak of something quite as interesting, and I really think quite as important. And this was my lady's making friends with Harry Gregson. I do believe she did it for Mr. Horner's sake, but of course I can only conjecture why my lady did anything. But I heard one day from Mary Legard that my lady had sent for Harry to come and see her, if he was well enough to walk so far, and the next day he was shown into the room he had been in once before under such unlucky circumstances. The lad looked pale enough as he stood propping himself on his crutch, and the instant my lady saw him she bade John Footman place a stool for him to sit down upon while she spoke to him. It might be his paleness that gave his whole face a more refined and gentle look, but I suspect it was that the boy was apt to take impressions, and that Mr. Horner's grave, dignified ways and Mr. Gray's tender and quiet manners had altered him. And then the thoughts of illness and death seem to turn many of us into gentlemen and gentlewomen, as long as such thoughts are in our minds. We cannot speak loudly or angrily at such times. We are not apt to be eager about mere worldly things, for our very awe at our own quickened sense of the nearness of the invisible world makes us calm and serene about the petty trifles of today. At least, I know that was the explanation Mr. Gray once gave me of what we all thought the great improvement in Harry Gregson's way of behaving. My lady hesitated so long about what she had best say that Harry grew a little frightened at her silence. A few months ago it would have surprised me more than it did now, but since my lord her son's death she had seemed altered in many ways, more uncertain and distrustful of herself, as it were. At last she said, and I think there were tears in her eyes, "My poor little fellow, you have had a narrow escape with your life since I saw you last." To this there was nothing to be said but "Yes," and again there was silence. "And you have lost a good, kind friend in Mr. Horner." The boy's lips worked, and I think he said, "Please don't," but I can't be sure. At any rate, my lady went on, "And so have I. A good, kind friend he was to both of us, and to you he wished to show his kindness in even a more generous way than he has done. Mr. Gray has told you about his legacy to you, has he not?" There was no sign of eager joy in the lad's face, as if he realized the power and pleasure of having what to him must have seemed like a fortune. "Mr. Gray said as how he left me a matter of money." "Yes, he has left you 200 pounds." "But I would rather have had him alive, my lady," he burst out, sobbing as if his heart would break. "My lad, I believe you. We would rather have our dead alive, would we not? And there is nothing in money that can comfort us for their loss. But you know, Mr. Gray has told you, who has appointed all our times to die. Mr. Horner was a good, just man, and has done well and kindly, both by me and you. You perhaps do not know," and now I understand what my lady has been making up her mind to say to Harry all the time she was hesitating how to begin, "that Mr. Horner at one time meant to leave you a great deal more, probably all he had, with the exception of a legacy to his old clerk Morrison. But he knew that this estate, on which my forefathers had lived for 600 years, was in debt, and that I had no immediate chance of paying off this debt, and yet He felt that it was a very sad thing for an old property like this to belong in parts to those other men who had lent the money. "You understand me, I think, my little man?" she said, questioning Harry's face. He had left off crying and was trying to understand with all his might and main, and I think he had got a pretty good general idea of the state of affairs, though probably he was puzzled by the term "the estate being in debt." But he was sufficiently interested to want my lady to go on, and he nodded his head at her to signify this to her. "So Mr. Horner took the money which he had once meant to be yours, and has left the greater part of it to me, with the intention of helping me to pay off this debt I have told you about. It will go a long way, and I shall try hard to save the rest, and then I shall die happy in leaving the land free from debt." She paused. "But I shall not die happy in thinking of you. I do not know if having money, or even having a great estate and much honor, is a good thing for any of us. But God sees fit that some of us should be called to this condition, and it is our duty then to stand by our posts like brave soldiers. Now Mr. Horner intended you to have this money first. I shall only call it borrowing from you, Harry Gregson, if I take it and use it to pay off the debt. I shall pay Mr. Gray interest on this money, because he is to stand as your guardian, as it were, till you come of age, and he must fix what ought to be done with it, so as to fit for you, spending the principal rightly, when the estate can repay it to you. I suppose now it will be right for you to be educated. That will be another snare that will come with your money. But have courage, Harry. Both education and money may be used rightly, if we only pray against the temptations they bring with them." Harry could make no answer, though I am sure he understood it all. My lady wanted to get him to talk to her a little, by way of becoming acquainted with what was passing in his mind, and she asked him what he would like to have done with his money, if he could have part of it now. To such a simple question, involving no talk about feelings, his answer came readily enough. "Build a cottage for father, with stairs in it, and give Mr. Gray a schoolhouse. Oh, father does so want Mr. Gray for to have his wish. Father saw all the stones lying quarried and hewn in Farmer Hale's land. Mr. Gray had paid for them all himself, and father said he would work night and day, and little Tommy should carry mortar if the parson would let him, sooner than that he should be fretted and frabbed as he was, with no one giving him a helping hand or a kind word." Harry knew nothing of my lady's part in the affair. That was very clear. My lady kept silence. "If I might have a piece of my money, I would buy land from Mr. Brooks. He's got a bit to sell just at the corner of Hendon Lane, and I would give it to Mr. Gray. And perhaps, if your ladyship thinks I may be learned again, I might grow up into the schoolmaster." "You're a good boy," said my lady. "But there are more things to be thought of in carrying out such a plan than you are aware of. However, it shall be tried." "The school, my lady!" I exclaimed, almost thinking she did not know what she was saying. "Yes, the school. For Mr. Horner's sake, for Mr. Gray's sake, and last, not least, for this lad's sake, I will give the new plan a trial. Ask Mr. Gray to come up to me this afternoon about the land he wants. He need not go to a dissenter for it. And tell your father he shall have a good share in the building of it, and Tommy shall carry the mortar." "And may I be schoolmaster?" asked Harry eagerly. "We'll see about that," said my lady, amused. "It will be some time before that plan comes to pass, my little fellow." And now to return to Captain James. My first account of him was from Miss Galindo. "He's not above 30, and I must just pack up my pens and my paper and be off, for it would be the height of impropriety for me to be staying here as his clerk. It was all very well in the old master's days, but here I am, not 50 till next May, and this young unmarried man who is not even a widower. Oh, there would be no end of gossip. Besides, he looks as askance at me as I do at him. My black silk gown has no effect. He's afraid I shall marry him, but I won't. He may feel himself quite safe from that. And Mr. Smithson has been recommending a clerk to my lady. She would far rather keep me on, but I can't stop. I really could not think it proper." "What sort of a looking man is he?" "Oh, nothing particular. Short and brown and sunburnt. I did not think it became me to look at him. Well, now for the nightcaps.
I should have grudged anyone else doing them, for I have got such a pretty pattern." But when it came to Miss Galindo's leaving, there was a great misunderstanding between her and my lady. Miss Galindo had imagined that my lady had asked her as a favor to copy the letters and enter the accounts, and had agreed to do the work without the notion of being paid for doing so. She had now and then grieved over a very profitable order for needlework passing out of her hands on account of her not having time to do it because of her occupation at the Hall, but she had never hinted this to my lady, but gone on cheerfully at her writing as long as her clerkship was required. My lady was annoyed that she had not made her intention of paying Miss Galindo more clear in the first conversation she had had with her, but I suppose that she had been too delicate to be very explicit with regard to money matters, and now Miss Galindo was quite hurt at my lady's wanting to pay her for what she had done in such right down good will. "No," Miss Galindo said. "My own dear lady, you may be as angry with me as you like, but don't offer me money. Think of 26 years ago, and my poor Arthur, and as you were to me then. Besides, I wanted money, I don't disguise it, for a particular purpose, and when I found that, God bless you for asking me, I could do you a service, I turned it over in my mind, and I gave up one plan and took up another, and it's all settled now. Bessie's to leave school and come live with me. Don't please offer me money again. You don't know how glad I have been to do anything for you. Have not I, Margaret Dawson, did you not hear me say one day I would cut off my hand for my lady? For I am a stock of stone, that I should forget kindness. Oh, I have been so glad to work for you. And now Bessie's coming here, and no one knows anything about her, as if she had done anything wrong, poor child." "My dear Miss Galindo," replied my lady, "I will never ask you to take money again, only I thought it was quite understood between us, and you know you have taken money for a set of morning wrappers before now." "Yes, my lady, but that was not confidential. Now I was so proud to have something to do for you confidentially." "But who is Bessie?" asked my lady. "I do not understand who she is, or why she is to come and live with you." "Dear Miss Galindo, you must honor me by being confidential with me in your turn." End of chapter 12. Recording by Adina Owen. Of My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adina Owen. My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 13. I had always understood that Miss Galindo had once been in much better circumstances, but I had never liked to ask any questions respecting her. But about this time many things came out respecting her former life, which I will try and arrange, not, however, in the order in which I heard them, but rather as they occurred. Miss Galindo was the daughter of a clergyman in Westmoreland. Her father was the younger brother of a baronet, his ancestor having been one of those of James I.'s creation. This baronet uncle of Miss Galindo was one of the queer, out-of-the-way people who were bred at that time in that northern district of England. I had never heard much of him from anyone, besides this one great fact, that he had early disappeared from his family, which indeed only consisted of a brother and sister who died unmarried, and lived no one knew where, somewhere on the continent it was supposed, for he had never returned from the grand tour which he had been sent to make, according to the general fashion of the day, as soon as he left Oxford. He corresponded occasionally with his brother the clergyman, but the letters passed through a banker's hands, the banker being pledged to secrecy, and, as he told Mr. Galindo, having the penalty, if he broke his pledge, of losing the whole profitable business, and of having the management of the baronet's affairs taken out of his hands, without any advantage accruing to the inquirer, for Sir Lawrence had told Messrs. Graham that, in case his place of residence was revealed by them, not only would he cease to bank with them, but instantly take measures to baffle any future inquiries as to his whereabouts, by removing to some distant country. Sir Lawrence paid a certain sum of money to his brother's account every year, but the time of this payment varied, and it was sometimes 18 or 19 months between the deposits. Then again, it would not be above a quarter of the time, showing that he intended it to be annual, but as this intention was never expressed in words, it was impossible to rely upon it,
and a great deal of this money was swallowed up by the necessity Mr. Galindo felt himself under of living in the large, old, rambling family mansion, which had been one of Sir Lawrence's rarely expressed desires. Mr. and Mrs. Galindo often planned to live upon their own small fortune and the income derived from the living, a vicarage, of which the great tithes went to Sir Lawrence as lay and proprietor, so as to put by the payments made by the baronet for the benefit of Laurentia, our Miss Galindo. But I suppose they found it difficult to live economically in a large house, even though they had it rent-free. They had to keep up with hereditary neighbors and friends, and could hardly keep doing it in the hereditary manner. One of these neighbors, a Mr. Gibson, had a son a few years older than Laurentia. The families were sufficiently intimate for the young people to see a good deal of each other, and I was told that this young Mr. Mark Gibson was an unusually prepossessing man. He seemed to have impressed everyone who spoke of him to me as being a handsome, manly, kind-hearted fellow. Just what a girl would be sure to find most agreeable. The parents either forgot that their children were growing up to man's and women's estate, or thought that the intimacy and probable attachment would be no bad thing, even if it did lead to a marriage. Still, nothing was ever said by young Gibson till later on, when it was too late, as it turned out. He went to and from Oxford, he shot and fished with Mr. Galindo, or came to the Mere to skate in winter time, was asked to accompany Mr. Galindo to the Hall, as the latter returned to the quiet dinner with his wife and daughter, and so, it went on, nobody much knew how, until one day when Mr. Galindo received a formal letter from his brother's bankers announcing Sir Lawrence's death of malaria fever at Albano, and congratulating Sir Hubert on his accession to the estates and the baronetcy. The king is dead, long live the king, as I have since heard the French express it. Sir Hubert and his wife were greatly surprised. Sir Lawrence was but 2 years older than his brother, and they had never heard of any illness till they heard of his death. They were sorry, very much shocked, but still a little elated at the succession to the baronetcy and estates. The London bankers had managed everything well. There was a large sum of ready money in their hands at Sir Hubert's service until he should touch his rents, the rent roll being 8,000 a year, and only Laurentia to inherit it all. Her mother, a poor clergyman's daughter, began to plan all sorts of fine marriages for her, nor was her father much behind his wife in his ambition. They took her up to London when they went to buy new carriages and dresses and furniture, and it was then and there she made my lady's acquaintance. How it was that they came to take a fancy to each other, I cannot say. My lady was of the old nobility, grand, composed, gentle, and stately in her ways. Miss Galindo must always have been hurried in her manner, and her energy must have shown itself in inquisitiveness and oddness even in her youth. But I don't pretend to account for things. I only narrate them, and the fact was this, that the elegant, fastidious countess was attracted to the country girl, who, on her part, almost worshipped my lady. My lady's notice of their daughter made her parents think, I suppose, that there was no match she might not command, she, the heiress of 8,000 a year, and visiting about among earls and dukes. So when they came back to their old Westmoreland Hall, and Mark Gibson rode over to offer his hand and heart and prospective estate of 900 a year to his old companion and playfellow Laurentia, Sir Hubert and Lady Galindo made very short work of it. They refused him plumply themselves, and when he begged to be allowed to speak to Laurentia, they found some excuse for refusing him the opportunity of doing so until they had talked to her themselves, and brought up every argument and fact in their power to convince her, a plain girl, and conscious of her plainness, that Mr. Mark Gibson had never thought of her in the way of marriage till after her father's accession to his fortune, and that it was the estate, not the young lady, that he was in love with. I suppose it will never be known in this world how far this supposition of theirs was true. My Lady Ludlow had always spoken as if it was, but perhaps events, which came to her knowledge about this time, altered her opinion. At any rate, the end of it was, Laurentia refused Mark, and almost broke her heart in doing so. He discovered the suspicions of Sir Hubert and Lady Galindo, and that they had persuaded their daughter to share in them. So he flung off with high words, saying that they did not know a true heart when they met with one, that although he had never offered till after Sir Lawrence's death, yet that his father knew all along that he had been attached to Laurentia, only that he, being the eldest of 5 children, and having as yet no profession, had had to conceal rather than to express an attachment which, in those days, he had believed was reciprocated. He had always meant to study for the bar, and the end of all he had hoped for had been to earn a moderate income, which he might ask Laurentia to share. This, or something like it, was what he said. But his reference to his father cut two ways. Old Mr. Gibson was known to be very keen about money. It was just as likely that he would urge Mark to make love to the heiress, now she was an heiress, as that he would have restrained him previously, as Mark said he had done. When this was repeated to Mark, he became proudly reserved, or sullen, and said that Laurentia, at any rate, might have known him better. He left the country, and went up to London to study law soon afterwards, and Sir Hubert and Lady Galindo thought they were well rid of him. But Laurentia never ceased reproaching herself, and never did to her dying days, I believe. The words, "she might have known me better," told to her by some kind friend or other, rankled in her mind and were never forgotten. Her father and mother took her up to London the next year, but she did not care to visit, dreaded going out even for a drive, lest she should see Mark Gibson's reproachful eyes, pined, and lost her health. Lady Ludlow saw this change with regret, and was told the cause by Lady Galindo, who, of course, gave her own version of Mark's conduct and motives. My lady never spoke to Miss Galindo about it, but tried constantly to interest and please her. It was at this time that my lady told Miss Galindo so much about her own early life, and about Hanbury, that Miss Galindo resolved, if ever she could, she would go and see the old place which her friend loved so well. The end of it all was that she came to live there, as we know. But a great change was to come first. Before Sir Hubert and Lady Galindo had left London on this their second visit, they had a letter from the lawyer, whom they employed, saying that Sir Lawrence had left an heir, his legitimate child by an Italian woman of low rank; at least, legal claims to the title and property had been sent in to him on the boy's behalf. Sir Lawrence had always been a man of adventurous and artistic rather than of luxurious tastes, and it was supposed, when all came to be proved at the trial, that he was captivated by the free, beautiful life they led in Italy, and had married this Neapolitan fisherman's daughter, who had people about her shrewd enough to see that the ceremony was legally performed. She and her husband had wandered about the shores of the Mediterranean for years, leading a happy, careless, irresponsible life, unencumbered by any duties except those connected with a rather numerous family. It was enough for her that they never wanted money, and that her husband's love was always continued to her. She hated the name of England, wicked, cold, heretic England, and avoided the mention of any subjects connected with her husband's early life. So that, when he died at Albano, she was almost roused out of her vehement grief to anger with the Italian doctor, who declared that he must write to a certain address to announce the death of Lawrence Galindo. For some time she feared lest English barbarians might come down upon her, making a claim to the children. She hid herself and them in the Abruzzi, living on the sale of what furniture and jewels Sir Lawrence had died possessed of. When these failed, she returned to Naples, which she had not visited since her marriage. Her father was dead, but her brother had inherited some of his keenness. He interested the priests, who made inquiries and found that the Galindo succession was worth securing an heir of the true faith. They stirred about it, obtained advice at the English embassy, and hence that letter to the lawyers, calling upon Sir Hubert to relinquish title and property, and to refund what money he had expended. He was vehement in his opposition to this claim. He could not bear to think of his brother having married a foreigner, a papist, a fisherman's daughter, nay, of his having become a papist himself. He was in despair at the thought of his ancestral property going to the issue of such a marriage. He fought tooth and nail, making enemies of his relations, and losing almost all his own private property, for he would go on against the lawyer's advice long after everyone was convinced except himself and his wife, and at last he was conquered. He gave up his living in gloomy despair. He would have changed his name if he could, so desirous was he to obliterate all tie between himself and the mongrel papist baronet and his Italian mother, and all the succession of children and nurses who came to take possession of the Hall soon after Mr. Hubert Galindo's departure, stayed there one winter, and then flitted back to Naples with gladness and delight. Mr. and Mrs. Hubert Galindo lived in London. He had obtained a curacy somewhere in the city. They would have been thankful now if Mr. Mark Gibson had renewed his offer. No one could accuse him of mercenary motives if he had done so. But he did not come forward, as they wished. They brought his silence up as a justification of what they had previously attributed to him. I don't know what Miss Galindo thought herself, but Lady Ludlow has told me how she shrank from hearing her parents abuse him. Lady Ludlow supposed that he was aware that they were living in London, His father must have known the fact, and it was curious if he had never named it to his son. Besides, the name was very uncommon, and it was unlikely that it should never come across him in the advertisements of charity sermons which the new and rather eloquent curate of St. Mark's, East, was asked to preach. All this time Lady Ludlow never lost sight of them, for Miss Galindo's sake, and when the father and mother died, it was my lady who upheld Miss Galindo in her determination not to apply for any provision to her cousin, the Italian baronet, but rather to live upon the 100 a year which had been settled on her mother and the children of his son Hubert's marriage by the old grandfather, Sir Lawrence. Mr. Mark Gibson had risen to some eminence as a barrister on the Northern Circuit, but had died unmarried in the lifetime of his father, a victim, so people said, of intemperance. Dr. Trevor, the physician who had been called in to Mr. Gray and Harry Gregson, had married a sister of his, and that was all my lady knew about the Gibson family. But who was Bessie? That mystery and secret came out, too, in process of time. Miss Galindo had been to Warwick some years before I arrived at Hanbury, on some kind of business or shopping, which can only be transacted in a county town. There was an old Westmoreland connection between her and Mrs. Trevor, though I believe the latter was too young to have been made aware of her brother's offer to Miss Galindo at the time when it took place, and such affairs, if they are unsuccessful, are seldom spoken about in the gentleman's family afterwards. But the Gibsons and Galindos had been county neighbours too long for the connection not to be kept up between two members settled far away from their early homes. Miss Galindo always desired her parcels to be sent to Dr. Trevor's when she went to Warwick for shopping purchases. If she were going any journey, and the coach did not come through Warwick as soon as she arrived, in my lady's coach or otherwise, from Hanbury, she went to Dr. Trevor's to wait. She was as much expected to sit down to the household meals as if she had been one of the family, and in after years it was Mrs. Trevor who managed her repository business for her. So, on the day I spoke of, she had gone to Dr. Trevor's to rest and possibly dine. The post in those times came in at all hours of the morning, and Dr. Trevor's letters had not arrived until after his departure on his morning round. Miss Galindo was sitting down to dinner with Mrs. Trevor and her 7 children, when the doctor came in. He was flurried and uncomfortable, and hurried the children away as soon as he decently could. Then, rather feeling Miss Galindo's presence an advantage, both as a present restraint on the violence of his wife's grief, and as a consoler when he was absent on his afternoon round, he told Mrs. Trevor of her brother's death. He had been taken ill on circuit, and had hurried back to his chambers in London only to die. She cried terribly, but Dr. Trevor said afterwards he never noticed that Miss Galindo cared much about it one way or another. She helped him to soothe his wife, promised to stay with her all afternoon instead of returning to Hanbury, and afterwards offered to remain with her while the doctor went to attend to the funeral. When they heard of the old love story between the dead man and Miss Galindo, brought up by mutual friends in Westmoreland, in the review which we are all inclined to take of the events of a man's life when he comes to die, they tried to remember Miss Galindo's speeches and ways of going on during this visit. She was a little pale, a little silent. Her eyes were sometimes swollen and her nose red, but she was at an age when such appearances are generally attributed to a bad cold in the head rather than any more sentimental reason. They felt towards her as towards an old friend, a kindly, useful, eccentric old maid. She did not expect more or wish them to remember that she might once have had other hopes or more youthful feelings. Dr. Trevor thanked her very warmly for staying with his wife when he returned home from London, where the funeral had taken place. He begged Miss Galindo to stay with them when the children were gone to bed, and she was preparing to leave the husband and wife by themselves. He told her and his wife many particulars, then paused, and went on, "And Mark has left a child, a little girl."
"But he was never married!" exclaimed Mrs. Trevor.
"A little girl," continued her husband, "whose mother, I conclude, is dead. At any rate, the child was in possession of his chambers, she and an old nurse, who seemed to have charge of everything, and has cheated poor Mark, I should fancy, not a little."
"But the child?" asked Miss Trevor, still almost breathless with astonishment. "How do you know it's his?"
"The nurse told me it was, with great appearance of indignation at my doubting it. I asked the little thing her name, and all I could get was 'Bessie,' and a cry of 'Me wants papa.' The nurse said the mother was dead, and she knew no more about it than that Mr. Gibson had engaged her to take care of the little girl, calling it his child. One or two of his lawyer friends, whom I met with at the funeral, told me they were aware of the existence of the child.
"What's to be done with her?" asked Mrs. Gibson.
"Nay, I don't know," replied he. "Mark has hardly left assets enough to pay his debts, and your father is not inclined to come forward."
That night, as Dr. Trevor sat in his study after his wife had gone to bed, Miss Galindo knocked at his door. She and he had a long conversation. The result was that he accompanied Miss Galindo up to town the next day, that they took possession of the little Bessie, and she was brought down and placed at nurse at a farm in the country near Warwick, Miss Galindo undertaking to pay one half of the expense and to furnish her with clothes, and Dr. Trevor undertaking that the remaining half should be furnished by the Gibson family, or by himself in their default. Miss Galindo was not fond of children, and I dare say she dreaded taking this child to live with her for more reasons than one. My Lady Ludlow could not endure any mention of illegitimate children. It was a principle of hers that society ought to ignore them, and I believe Miss Galindo had always agreed with her until now, when the thing came home to her womanly heart. Still, she shrank from having this child of some strange woman under her roof. She went over to see it from time to time. She worked at its clothes long after everyone thought she was in bed, and when the time came for Bessie to be sent to school, Miss Galindo labored away more diligently than ever in order to pay the increased expense, for the Gibson family had, at first, paid their part of the compact, but, with unwillingness and grudging hearts, then they had left it off altogether, and it fell hard on Dr. Trevor with his 12 children, and latterly Miss Galindo had taken upon herself almost all the burden. One can hardly live and labor and plan and make sacrifices for any human creature without learning to love it. And Bessie loved Miss Galindo too, for all the poor girl's scanty pleasures came from her, and Miss Galindo had always a kind word, and latterly many a kind caress, for Mark Gibson's child, whereas if she went to Dr. Trevor's for her holiday, she was overlooked and neglected in that bustling family, who seemed to think that if she had comfortable board and lodging under their roof, it was enough. I am sure now that Miss Galindo had often longed to have Bessie to live with her, but as long as she could pay for her being at school, she did not like to take so bold a step as bringing her home, knowing what the effect of the consequent explanation would be on my lady. And as the girl was now more than 17, and past the age when young ladies are usually kept at school, and as there was no great demand for governesses in those days, and as Bessie had never been taught any trade by which to earn her own living, why, I don't exactly see what could have been done but for Miss Galindo to bring her to her own home in Hanbury. For although the child had grown up lately in a kind of unexpected manner into a young woman, Miss Galindo might have kept her at school for a year longer, if she could have afforded it. But this was impossible when she became Mr. Horner's clerk, and relinquished all the payment of her repository work. And perhaps, after all, she was not sorry to be compelled to take the step she was longing for. At any rate, Bessie came to live with Miss Galindo in a very few weeks from the time when Captain James set Miss Galindo free to superintend her own domestic economy again. For a long time I knew nothing about this inhabitant of Hanbury. My lady never mentioned her in any way. This was in accordance with Lady Ludlow's well-known principles. She neither saw nor heard, nor was in any way cognizant of the existence of those who had no legal right to exist at all. If Miss Galindo had hoped to have an exception made in Bessie's favour, she was mistaken. My lady sent a note inviting Miss Galindo herself to tea one evening, about a month after Bessie came, but Miss Galindo had a cold and could not come. The next time she was invited she had an engagement at home, a step nearer to the absolute truth, and the third time she had a young friend staying with her whom she was unable to leave. My lady accepted every excuse as a bona fide and took no further notice. I missed Miss Galindo very much. We all did, for in those days when she was clerk, she was sure to come in and find the opportunity of saying something amusing to some of us before she went away. And I, as an invalid, or perhaps from natural tendency, was particularly fond of little bits of village gossip. There was no Mr. Horner. He even had come in, now and then, with formal, stately pieces of intelligence. And there was no Miss Galindo in these days. I missed her much, and so did my lady, I am sure.
Behind all her quiet, sedate manner, I am certain her heart ached sometimes for a few words from Miss Galindo, who seemed to have absented herself altogether from the hall now Bessie was come. Captain James might be very sensible and all that, but not even my lady could call him a substitute for the old familiar friends. He was a thorough sailor, as sailors were in those days, swore a good deal, drank a good deal, without its ever affecting him in the least, and was very prompt and kind-hearted in all his actions. But he was not accustomed to women, as my lady once said, and would judge in all things for himself. My lady had expected, I think, to find someone who would take his notions on the management of her estate from her ladyship's own self, but he spoke as if he were responsible for the good management of the whole, and must, consequently, be allowed full liberty of action. He had been too long in command over men at sea to like to be directed by a woman in anything he undertook, even though that woman was my lady. I suppose this was the common sense my lady spoke of, but when common sense goes against us, I don't think we value it quite so much as we ought to do. Lady Ludlow was proud of her personal superintendence of her own estate. She liked to tell us how her father used to take her with him on his rides, and bid her observe this and that, and on no account to allow such and such things to be done. But I have heard that the first time she told all this to Captain James, he told her point blank that he had heard from Mr. Smithson that the farms were much neglected and the rents sadly behindhand, and that he meant to set to in good earnest and study agriculture, and see how he could remedy the state of things. My lady would, I am sure, be greatly surprised, but what could she do? Here was the very man she had chosen herself, setting to with all his energy to conquer the defect of ignorance, which was all that those who had presumed to offer her ladyship advice had ever had to say against him. Captain James read Arthur Young's Tours in all his spare time, as long as he was an invalid, and shook his head at my lady's accounts as to how the land had been cropped or left fallow from time immemorial. Then he set to and tried too many new experiments at once. My lady looked on in dignified silence, but all the farmers and tenants were in an uproar, and prophesied 100 failures. Perhaps 50 did occur. There were only half as many as Lady Ludlow had feared. But they were twice as many, 4, 8 times as many as the captain had anticipated. His openly expressed disappointment made him popular again. The rough country people could not have understood silent and dignified regret at the failure of his plans, but they sympathized with the man who swore at his ill success, sympathized even while they chuckled over his discomfiture. Mr. Brooke, the retired tradesman, did not cease blaming him for not succeeding, and for swearing. "What could you expect from a sailor?" Mr. Brooke asked, even in my lady's hearing, though he might have known Captain James was my lady's own personal choice, from the old friendship Mr. Urian had always shown for him. I think it was this speech of the Birmingham baker's that made my lady determined to stand by Captain James and encourage him to try again, for she would not allow that her choice had been an unwise one, at the bidding, as it were, of a dissenting tradesman, the only person in the neighbourhood, too, who had flaunted about in coloured clothes, when all the world was in mourning for my lady's only son. Captain James would have thrown the agency up at once if my lady had not felt herself bound to justify the wisdom of her choice by urging him to stay. He was much touched by her confidence in him, and swore a great oath that the next year he would make the land such as it had never been before for produce. It was not my lady's way to repeat anything she had heard, especially to another person's disadvantage, so I don't think she ever told Captain James of Mr. Brooke's speech about a sailor's being likely to mismanage the property, and the captain was too anxious to succeed in this the second year of his trial, to be above going to the flourishing, shrewd Mr. Brooke, and asking his advice as to the best method of working the estate. I dare say, if Miss Galindo had been as intimate as formerly at the Hall, we should all of us have heard of this new acquaintance of the agent's long before we did. As it was, I'm sure my lady never dreamed that the captain, who held opinions that were even more church and king than her own, could ever have made friends with a Baptist baker from Birmingham, even to serve her ladyship's own interests in the most loyal manner. We heard of it first from Mr. Gray, who came now often to see my lady, for neither he nor she could forget the solemn tie which the fact of his being the person to acquaint her with my lord's death had created between them. For true and holy words spoken at that time, though having no reference to aught below the solemn subjects of life and death, had made her withdraw her opposition to Mr. Gray's wish about establishing a village school. She had sighed a little, it's true, and was even yet more apprehensive than hopeful as to the result, but almost as if As a memorial to my lord, she had allowed a kind of rough schoolhouse to be built on the green, just by the church, and had gently used the power she undoubtedly had in expressing her strong wish that the boys might only be taught to read and write, and the first 4 rules of arithmetic, while the girls were only to learn to read and to add up in their heads, and the rest of the time to work at mending their own clothes, knitting stockings, and spinning. My lady presented the school with more spinning wheels than there were girls, and requested that there might be a rule that they should have spun so many hanks of flax, and knitted so many pairs of stockings, before they ever were taught to read at all. After all, it was but making the best of a bad job with my poor lady, but life was not what it had been to her. I remember well the day that Mr. Gray pulled some delicately fine yarn, and I was a good judge of those things, out of his pocket, and laid it, and a capital pair of knitted stockings, before my lady, as the first fruits, so to say, of his school. I recollect seeing her put on her spectacles, and carefully examine both productions. Then she passed them to me. "This is well, Mr. Gray. I am much pleased. You are fortunate in your schoolmistress. She has had both proper knowledge of womanly things and much patience. Who is she? One out of our village?" "My lady," said Mr. Gray, stammering and coloring in his old fashion. "Miss Bessy is so very kind as to teach all these sorts of things. Miss Bessy and Miss Galindo sometimes." My lady looked at him over her spectacles, but she only repeated the words "Miss Bessy," and paused, as if trying to remember who such a person could be, and he, if he had then intended to say more, was quelled by her manner, and dropped the subject. He went on to say that he had thought it his duty to decline the subscription to his school offered by Mr. Brooke, because he was a dissenter; that he, Mr. Gray, feared that Captain James, through whom Mr. Brooke's offer of money had been made, was offended at his refusing to accept it from a man who held heterodox opinions, nay, whom Mr. Gray suspected of being infected by Dodwell's heresy. "I think there must be some mistake," said my lady, "or I have misunderstood you. Captain James would never be sufficiently with a schismatic to be employed by that man Brooke in distributing his charities. I should have doubted until now if Captain James knew him." "Indeed, my lady, he not only knows him, but is intimate with him, I regret to say. I have repeatedly seen the captain and Mr. Brooke walking together, going through the fields together, and people do say—" My lady looked up in interrogation at Mr. Gray's pause. "I disapprove of gossip, and it may be untrue, but people do say that Captain James is very attentive to Miss Brooke." "Impossible!" said my lady indignantly. "Captain James is a loyal and religious man. I beg your pardon, Mr. Gray, but it is impossible." End of chapter 13. Recording by Adina Owen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adina Owen. My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 14. Like many other things which have been declared to be impossible, this report of Captain James being attentive to Miss Brooke turned out to be very true. The mere idea of her agent being on the slightest possible terms of acquaintance with the dissenter, the tradesman, the Birmingham Democrat, who had come to settle in our good, orthodox, aristocratic, and agricultural Hanbury, made my lady very uneasy. Miss Galindo's misdemeanor in having taken Miss Bessy to live with her faded into a mistake, a mere error of judgment in comparison with Captain James's intimacy at Yeast House, as the Brookes called their ugly, square-built farm. My lady talked herself quite into complacency with Miss Galindo, and even Miss Bessy was named by her, the first time I had ever been aware that my lady recognized her existence. But I recollect it was a long rainy afternoon, and I sat with her ladyship, and we had time and opportunity for a long uninterrupted talk. Whenever we had been silent for a little while, she began again, with something like a wonder how it was that Captain James could ever have commenced an acquaintance with
That man Brooke. My lady recapitulated all the times she could remember that anything had occurred or had been said by Captain James which she could now understand as throwing light upon the subject. He said once that he was anxious to bring in the Norfolk system of cropping, and spoke a good deal about Mr. Coke of Holkham, who, by the way, was no more a Coke than I am, collateral in the female line, which counts for little or nothing among the great old commoner families of pure blood. And his new ways of cultivation, of course, new men bring in new ways, but it does not follow that either are better than the old ways. However, Captain James has been very anxious to try turnips and bone manure, and he really is a man of such good sense and energy, and was so sorry last year about the failure that I consented, and now I begin to see my error. I have always heard that town bakers adulterate their flour with bone dust, and of course Captain James would be aware of this, and go to Brooke to inquire where the article was to be purchased. My lady always ignored the fact, which had sometimes, I suspect, been brought under her very eyes during her drives, that Mr. Brooks's new fields were in a state of far higher cultivation than her own, so she could not, of course, perceive that there was any wisdom to be gained from asking the advice of the tradesman turned farmer. But by and by, this fact of her agent's intimacy with the person whom in the whole world she most disliked, with that sort of dislike in which a large amount of the uncomfortableness is combined, the dislike which conscientious people sometimes feel to another without knowing why, and yet which they cannot indulge in with comfort to themselves without having a moral reason why, came before my lady in many shapes. For indeed I am sure that Captain James was not a man to conceal or be ashamed of one of his actions. I cannot fancy his ever lowering his strong, loud, clear voice, or having a confidential conversation with anyone. When his crops had failed, all the village had known it. He complained, he regretted, he was angry, or owned himself a fool all down the village street. And the consequence was that, although he was far more passionate than Mr. Horner, all the tenants liked him far better. People in general take a kindlier interest in anyone, the workings of whose mind and heart they can watch and understand, than in a man who only lets you know what he's been thinking about and feeling by what he does. But Harry Gregson was faithful to the memory of Mr. Horner. Miss Galindo had told me that she used to watch him hobble out of the way of Captain James, as if to accept his notice, however good-naturedly given, would have been a kind of treachery to his former benefactor. But Gregson, the father, and the new agent rather took to each other, and one day, much to my surprise, I heard that the poaching, tinkering vagabond, as the people used to call Gregson when I first had come to live at Hanbury, had been appointed gamekeeper, Mr. Gray standing godfather, as it were, to his trustworthiness, as if he were trusted with anything, which I thought at the time was rather an experiment, only it answered, as many of Mr. Gray's deeds of daring did. It was curious how he was growing to be a kind of autocrat in the village, and how unconscious he was of it. He was as shy and awkward and nervous as ever in any affair that was not of some moral consequence to him. But as soon as he was convinced that the thing was right, he shut his eyes and ran and butted at it like a ram, as Captain James once expressed it in talking over something Mr. Gray had done. People in the village said they never knew what the parson would be at next, or they might have said where his reverence would next turn up. For I have heard his marching right into the middle of a set of poachers, gathered together for some desperate midnight enterprise, or walking into a public-house that lay just beyond the bounds of my lady's estate, and in that extra-parochial piece of ground I named long ago, and which was considered the rendezvous of all the ne'er-do-well characters for miles around, and where a person and a constable were held in much the same kind of esteem as unwelcome visitors. And yet Mr. Gray had his long fits of depression, in which he felt as if he were doing nothing, making no way in his work, useless and unprofitable, and better out of the world than in it. In comparison with the work he had set himself to do, what he did seemed to be nothing. I suppose it was constitutional, those attacks of lowness of spirit which he had about this time. perhaps a part of the nervousness which made him always so awkward when he came to the hall. Even Mrs. Medlicott, who almost worshipped the ground he trod on, as the saying is, owned that Mr. Gray never entered one of my lady's rooms without knocking down something, and too often breaking it. He would much sooner have faced a desperate poacher than a young lady any day. At least, so we thought. I do not know how it was that it came to pass that my lady became reconciled to Miss Galindo about this time, whether it was that her ladyship was weary of the unspoken coolness with her old friend, or that the specimens of delicate sewing and fine spinning at the school had mollified her towards Miss Bessy. But I was surprised to learn one day that Miss Galindo and her young friend were coming that very evening to tea at the Hall. This information was given me by Mrs. Medlicott as a message from my lady, who further went on to desire that certain little preparations should be made in her own private sitting-room, in which the greater part of my days were spent. From the nature of these preparations, I became quite aware that my lady intended to do honor to her expected visitors. Indeed, Lady Ludlow never forgave by halves, as I have known some people to do. Whoever was coming as a visitor to my lady, peeress or poor nameless girl, there was a certain amount of preparation required in order to do them fitting honor. I do not mean to say that the preparation was of the same degree of importance in each case. I dare say, if a peeress had come to visit us at the Hall, the covers would have been taken off the furniture in the white drawing-room. They never were uncovered all the time I stayed at the Hall, because my lady would wish to offer her the ornaments and luxuries which this grand visitor, who never came, I wish she had, I did so want to see that furniture uncovered, was accustomed to at home, and to present to them to her, in the best order which my lady could. That same rule, mollified, held good with Miss Galindo. Certain things in which my lady knew she took an interest were laid out ready for her to examine this very day, and what was more, great books of prints were laid out, such as I remembered my lady had brought forth to beguile my own early days of illness, Mr. Hogarth's works, and the like, which I was sure were put out for Miss Bessy. No one knows how curious I was to see this mysterious Miss Bessy, 20 times more mysterious, of course, for want of her surname. Then again, to try and account for my great curiosity, of which in recollection I am more than half ashamed. I had been leading the quiet, monotonous life of a crippled invalid for many years, shut up from any sight of new faces, and this was to be the face of one whom I had thought about so much and so long. Oh, I think I might be excused. Of course they drank tea in the great hall with the 4 young gentlewomen who, with myself, formed the small bevy now under her ladyship's charge. Of those who were at Hanbury when first I came, none remained. All were married, or gone once more to live at some home which could be called their own, whether the ostensible head were father or brother. I myself was not without some hopes of a similar kind. My brother Harry was now a curate in Westmoreland, and wanted me to go and live with him, as eventually I did for a time. But that is neither here nor there at present. What I am talking about is Miss Bessy. After a reasonable time had elapsed, occupied, as I well knew, by the meal in the great hall, the measured yet agreeable conversation afterwards, and a certain promenade around the hall, and through the drawing-rooms, with pauses before different pictures, the history or subject of each which was invariably told by my lady to every new visitor, a sort of giving them the freedom of the old family seat, by describing the kind and nature of the great progenitors who had lived there before the narrator. I heard the steps approaching my lady's room, where I lay. I think I was in such a state of nervous expectation that if I could have moved easily I should have got up and run away, and yet I need not have been, for Miss Galindo was not in the least altered. Her nose was a little redder, to be sure, but then that might only have been a temporary cause in the private crying I know she would have had before coming to see her dear Lady Ludlow once again. But I could almost have pushed Miss Galindo away as she intercepted me in my view of the mysterious Miss Bessy. Miss Bessy was, as I knew, only about 18, but she looked older. Dark hair, dark eyes, a tall, firm figure, a good, sensible face with a serene expression, not in the least disturbed by what I had been thinking must be such awful circumstances as a first introduction to my lady, who had so disapproved of her very existence. Those are the clearest impressions I remember of my first interview with Miss Bessy. She seemed to observe us all, in her quiet manner, quite as much as I did her, but she spoke very little, occupied herself, indeed, as my lady had planned, with looking over the great books of engravings. I think I must have foolishly intended to make her feel at ease by my patronage, but she was seated far away from my sofa in order to command the light, and really seemed so unconcerned at her unwonted circumstances that she did not need my countenance or kindness. One thing I did like, her watchful look at Miss Galindo from time to time. It showed that her thoughts and sympathy were ever at Miss Galindo's service, as indeed they well might be. When Miss Bessy spoke, her voice was full and clear, and what she said, to the purpose, though there was a slight provincial accent in her way of speaking. After a while, my lady set us two to play at chess, a game which I had lately learned at Mr. Gray's suggestion. Still, we did not talk much together, though we were becoming attracted towards each other, I fancy. "You will play well," she said. "You have only learnt about 6 months, have you? And yet you can nearly beat me who have been at it as many years." "I began to learn last November. I remember Mr. Gray's bringing me Philidor on chess one very foggy, dismal day." What made her look up so suddenly, with bright inquiry in her eyes? What made her silent for a moment, as if in thought, and then go on with something, I know not what, in quite an altered tone? My lady and Miss Galindo went on talking while I sat thinking. I heard Captain James's name mentioned pretty frequently, and at last my lady put down her work and said, almost with tears in her eyes, I cannot believe it. He must be aware she is a schismatic, a baker's daughter, and he is a gentleman by virtue and feeling, as well as by his profession, though his manners may be at times a little rough. My dear Miss Galindo, what will this world come to?" Miss Galindo might possibly be aware of her own share in bringing the world to the pass which now dismayed my lady. For of course, though all was now over and forgiven, yet Miss Bessy's being received into a respectable maiden lady's house was one of the portents as to the world's future which alarmed her ladyship, and Miss Galindo knew this. But at any rate, she had too lately been forgiven herself not to plead for mercy for the next offender against my lady's delicate sense of fitness and propriety, so she replied, "Indeed, my lady, I have long left off trying to conjecture what makes Jack fancy Jill, or Jill Jack. It's best to sit down quiet under the belief that marriages are made for us, somewhere out of this world, and out of the range of this world's reason and laws. I'm not sure that I should settle it down that they were made in heaven. T'other place seems to me as likely as a workshop, but at any rate, I've given up troubling my head as to why they take place. Captain James is a gentleman. I make no doubt of that ever since I saw him stop to pick up old Goody Blake, when she tumbled down on the slide last winter, and then swear at a little lad who was laughing at her, and cuff him till he tumbled down crying. But we must have bread somehow, and though I like it better baked at home in a good sweet brick oven, yet as some folks never can get it to rise, I don't see why a man may not be a baker. You see, my lady, I look upon baking as a simple trade, and as such lawful. There is no machine comes in to take away a man's or woman's power of earning their living, like the spinning jenny, the old busybody that she is, to knock up all our good old women's livelihood and send them to their graves before their time. There's an invention of the enemy, if you will." "That's very true," said my lady, shaking her head. "But baking bread is wholesome, straightforward elbow work. They have not got to inventing any contrivance for that yet, thank heaven. It does not seem to me natural, nor according to Scripture, that iron and steel, whose brows can't sweat, should be made to do man's work. And so I say, all those trades where iron and steel do the work ordained to man at the fall are unlawful, and I never stand up for them. But say this baker Brooke did knead his bread, and make it rise, and then that people who had perhaps no good ovens came to him and bought his good light bread, and in this manner he turned an honest penny and got rich. Why, all I say, my lady, is this. I dare say he would have been born a Hanbury or a lord if he could, if he was not. It is no fault of his, that I can see, that he made good bread, being a baker by trade, and got money and bought his land." It was his misfortune, not his fault, that he was not a person of quality by birth." "That's very true," said my lady, after a moment's pause for consideration. "But although he was a baker, he might have been a churchman. Even your eloquence, Miss Galindo, shan't convince me that that is not his own fault." "I don't see even that, begging your pardon, my lady," said Miss Galindo, emboldened by the first success of her eloquence. "When a Baptist is a baby, if I understand their creed aright, he is not baptized, and consequently he can have no godfathers and godmothers to do anything for him in his baptism. You agree to that, my lady?" My lady would rather have known what her acquiescence would lead to before acknowledging that she could not dissent from this first proposition. Still she gave her tacit agreement by bowing her head. "And you know, our godfathers and godmothers are expected to promise and vow 3 things in our name, when we are little babies, and can do nothing but squall for ourselves. It is a great privilege, but don't let us be hard upon those who have not had the chance of godfathers and godmothers. Some people we know are born with silver spoons, that's to say a godfather to give one things, and teach one's catechism, and to see that we're confirmed into good church-going Christians, and others with wooden ladles in their mouths. These poor last folks must just be content to be godfatherless orphans and dissenters all their lives. And if they are tradespeople into the bargain, so much the worse for them. But let us be humble Christians, my dear lady, not hold our heads too high because we were born orthodox quality." "You go on too fast, Miss Galindo. I can't follow you. Besides, I do believe dissent to be an invention of the devil's. Why can't they believe as we do? It's very wrong. Besides, it's schism and heresy, and you know the Bible says that it's as bad as witchcraft." My lady was not convinced, as I could see. After Miss Galindo had gone, she sent Miss Medlicott for certain books out of the great old library upstairs, and had them made into a parcel under her own eye. "If Captain James comes tomorrow, I will speak to him about these Brooks. I have not hitherto liked to speak to him, because I did not wish to hurt him. But supposing there could be any truth in the reports about his intimacy with them, but now I will try and do my duty by him and them. Surely this great body of divinity will bring them back to the true church." I could not tell, for though my lady read me over the titles, I was not any the wiser as to their contents. Besides, I was much more anxious to consult my lady as to my own change of place. I showed her the letter I had that day received from Harry, and we once more talked over the expediency of my going to live with him, and trying what entire change of air would do to re-establish my failing health. I could say anything to my lady, she was so sure to understand me rightly. For one thing, she never thought of herself, so I had no fear of hurting her by stating the truth. I told her how happy my years had been while passed under her roof, but that now I had begun to wonder whether I had not duties elsewhere in making a home for Harry, and whether the fulfilment of these duties, quiet ones they must needs be in the case of such a cripple as myself, would not prevent my sinking into the querulous habits of thinking and talking, in which I found myself occasionally falling, and to which there was the prospect of benefit from the more bracing air of the north. It was then settled that my departure from Hanbury, my happy home for so long, was to take place before many weeks had passed. And as when one period of life is about to be shut up forever, we are sure to look back upon it with fond regret, so I, happy enough in my future prospects, could not avoid recurring to all the days of my life in the Hall, from the time when I came to it, a shy, awkward girl, scarcely past childhood, to now, when a grown woman, past childhood, almost from the very character of my illness, past youth, I was looking forward to leaving my lady's house as a residence for ever. As it has turned out, I never saw her or it again. Like a piece of sea wreck, I have drifted away from those days, quiet, happy, eventless days, very happy to remember. I thought of good, jovial Mr. Mountford, and his regrets that he might not keep a pack, a very small pack, of harriers, and his merry ways and his love of good eating, and of the first coming of Mr. Gray, and my lady's attempt to quench his sermons when they tended to enforce any duty connected with education. And now we had an absolute schoolhouse in the village, and since Miss Bessie's drinking tea at the hall, my lady had been twice inside it to give directions about some fine yarn she was having spun for table napery, and her ladyship had so outgrown her old custom of dispensing with sermon or discourse, that even during the temporary preaching of Mr. Crosse she had never had recourse to it, though I believe she would have had all the congregation on her side if she had. And Mr. Horner was dead, and Captain James reigned in his stead. Good, steady, severe, silent Mr. Horner, with his clock-like regularity, and his snuff-colored clothes, and his silver buckles. I have often wondered which one misses most when they are dead and gone, the bright creatures, full of life, who are hither and thither and everywhere, so that no one can reckon upon their coming and going, with whom stillness and the long quiet of the grave seems utterly irreconcilable, so full are they of vivid motion and passion, or the slow, serious people, whose movements, nay, whose very words, seem to go by clockwork, who never appear much to affect the course of our life while they are with us, but whose methodical ways show themselves, when they are gone, to have been intertwined with our very roots of daily existence. I think I miss these last the most, although I may have loved the former best. Captain James was never to me what Mr. Horner was, though the latter had hardly changed a dozen words with me at the day of his death. Then Miss Galindo! I remember the time as if it had been only yesterday, when she was but a name, a very odd one to me. Then she was a queer, abrupt, disagreeable, busy old maid. Now I love her dearly, and I found out that I was almost jealous of Miss Bessie. Mr. Gray I never thought of with love. The feeling was almost reverence with which I looked upon him. I have not wished to speak much of myself, or else I could have told you how much he had been to me during these long weary years of illness, but he was almost as much to every one, rich and poor, from my lady down to Miss Galindo's Sally. The village, too, had a different look about it. I'm sure I could not tell you what caused the change, but there were no more lounging young men to form a group at the cross-road, at a time of day when young men ought to be at work. I don't say this was all Mr. Gray's doing, for there really was so much to do in the fields that there was but little time for lounging nowadays, and the children were hushed up in school, and better behaved out of it too than in the days when I used to be able to go my lady's errands in the village. I went so little about now, that I am sure I can't tell who Miss Galindo found to scold, and yet she looked so well and so happy, that I think she must have had her accustomed portion of that wholesome exercise. Before I left Hanbury, the rumour that Captain James was going to marry Miss Brooke, Baker Brooke's eldest daughter, who had only a sister to share his property with her, was confirmed. He himself announced it to my lady, nay, more with a courage gained, I suppose, in his former profession, where, as I have heard, he led his ship into many a post of danger. He asked her ladyship, the Countess Ludlow, if he might bring his bride-elect, the Baptist baker's daughter, and present her to my lady. I am glad I was not present when he made this request. I should have felt so much ashamed for him, and I could not have helped being anxious till I heard my lady's answer, if I had been there. Of course she acceded, but I can fancy the grave surprise of her look. I wonder if Captain James noticed it. I hardly dared ask my lady after the interview had taken place what she thought of the bride-elect, but I hinted my curiosity, and she told me that if the young person had applied to Mrs. Medlicott for the situation of cook, and Mrs. Medlicott had engaged her, she thought that it would have been a very suitable arrangement. I understood from this how little she thought a marriage with Captain James, R.N., suitable. About a year after I left Hanbury, I received a letter from Miss Galindo. I think I can find it. Yes, this is it. Hanbury, May 4th, 1812. Dear Margaret, you ask for news of us all. Don't you know there is no news in Hanbury? Did you ever hear of an event here? Now, If you have answered yes in your own mind to these questions, you have fallen into my trap, and never were more mistaken in your life. Hanbury is full of news, and we have more events on our hands than we know what to do with. I will take them in the order of the newspapers: births, deaths, and marriages. In the matter of births, Jenny Lucas has had twins not a week ago. Sadly too much of a good thing, you'll say. Very true, but then they died, so their birth did not much signify. My cat has kitten too. She has 3 kittens, which again you may observe is too much of a good thing, and so it would be if it were not for the next item of intelligence I shall lay before you. Captain and Mrs. James have taken the old house next to Pearson's, and the house is overrun with mice, which is just as fortunate for me as the King of Egypt's rat-ridden kingdom was to Dick Whittington. But for my cat's kittening decided me to go and call on the bride in hopes she wanted a cat, which she did like a sensible woman, as I do believe she is, in spite of baptism bakers, bread and Birmingham, and something worse than all, which you shall hear about if you'll only be patient. As I had got my best bonnet on, the one I bought when poor Lord Ludlow was last at Hanbury in '99, I thought it a great condescension in myself, always remembering the date of the Galindo baronetcy, to go and call on the bride, though I don't think so much of myself in everyday clothes, as you know. But who should I find there but my Lady Ludlow? She looks as frail and delicate as ever, but is, I think, in better heart ever since that old city merchant of a Hanbury took it into his head that he was a cadet of the Hanburys of Hanbury, and left her that handsome legacy. I'll warrant you that the mortgage was paid off pretty fast, and Mr. Horner's money, or my lady's money, or Harry Gregson's money, call it what you will, is invested in his name all right and tight, and they do talk of his being captain of his school, or Grecian, or something, or going to college. After all, Harry Gregson, the poacher's son! Well, to be sure we are living in strange times. But I have not done with the marriages yet. Captain James is all very well, but no one cares for it now. We are all so full of Mr. Grays. Yes, indeed, Mr. Gray is going to be married, and to nobody else but my little Bessie. I tell her she will have to nurse him half of the days of her life, he is such a frail little body, but she says she does not care for that, so that his body holds his soul, it is enough for her. She has a good spirit and a brave heart, has my Bessie. It is a great advantage that she won't have to mark her clothes over again, for when she has knitted herself her last set of stockings, I told her to put G for Galindo, if she did not choose to put it for Gibson, so she should be my child if she was no one else's. And now, you see, it stands for Gray, so there are 2 marriages, and what more would you have? And she promises to take another of my kittens. Now as to deaths, old Farmer Hale is dead. Poor old man. I should think his wife thought it a good riddance, for he beat her every day that he was drunk, and he was never sober, in spite of Mr. Gray. I don't think, as I tell him, that Mr. Gray would ever have found courage to speak to Bessie as long as Farmer Hale lived. He took the old gentleman's sins so much to heart, and seemed to think it was all his fault for not being able to make a sinner into a saint. The parish bull is dead, too. I was never so glad in my life. But they say we are to have a new one in his place. In the meantime I cross the common in peace, which is very convenient just now, when I have so often to go to Mr. Gray's to see about furnishing. Now, you think I have told you all the Hanbury news, don't you? Not so. The very greatest thing of all is to come. I won't tantalize you, but just out with it, for you would never guess it. My Lady Ludlow has given a party, just like any plebeian among us. We had tea and toast in the blue drawing-room, old John Footman waiting with Tom Diggles, the lad that used to frighten away crows in Farmer Hale's fields, following in my lady's livery, hair powdered and everything. Mrs. Medlicott made tea in my lady's own room. My lady looked like a splendid fairy queen of mature age, in black velvet, and the old lace which I have never seen her wear before since my lord's death. But the company, you'll say, why, we had the Parson of Clover, and the Parson of Headley, and the Parson of Marybank, and the 3 parsonesses, and Farmer Duncan, and the 2 Miss Duncans, and Mr. Gray, of course, and myself, and Bessie, and Captain and Mrs. James, yes, and Mr. and Mrs. Brooke. Think of that! I am not sure the parsons liked it, but he was there,
for he had been helping Captain James to get my lady's land into order, and then his daughter married the agent, and Mr. Gray, who ought to know, says that, after all, Baptists are not such bad people. And he was right against them at one time, as you may remember. Mrs. Brooke is a rough diamond, to be sure. People have said that of me, I know, but being a Galindo, I learnt manners in my youth, and can take them up when I choose. But Mrs. Brooke never learnt manners, I'll be bound. When John Footman handed her the tray with the teacups, she looked up at him as if she were sorely puzzled by that way of going on. I was sitting next to her, so I pretended not to see her perplexity and put her cream and sugar in for her, and was all ready to pop it into her hands when who should come up but that impudent lad Tom Diggles. I call him lad, for all his hair is powdered, for you know that it is not natural grey hair, with his tray full of cakes and what not, all as good as Miss Medlicott could make them. By this time, I should tell you, all the parsonesses were looking at Mrs. Brooke, for she had shown her want of breeding before, and the parsonesses, who were just a step above her in manners, were very much inclined to smile at her doings and sayings. Well, what does she do but pull out a clean bandana pocket handkerchief, all red and yellow silk, spread it over her best silk gown, as it was like enough a new one, for I had it from Sally, who had it from her cousin Molly, who is a dairywoman at the Brookses, that the Brookes were mighty set up with an invitation to drink tea at the Hall. There we were, Tom Diggles even on the grin. I wonder how long it is since he was own brother to a scarecrow, only not so decently dressed. And Mrs. Parsoness of Headley, I forget her name, and it's no matter, for she's an ill-bred creature. I hope Bessie will behave herself better, was right down bursting with laughter, and as near a hee-haw as ever a donkey was, when what does my lady do? Ay, there's my own dear Lady Ludlow, God bless her! She takes out her own pocket handkerchief, all snowy cambric, and lays it softly down on her velvet lap, for all the world as if she did it every day of her life, just like Mrs. Brooke, the baker's wife, and when the one got up to shake the crumbs into the fireplace, the other did just the same, but with such a grace, and such a look at us all. Tom Diggles went red all over, and Mrs. Parsoness of Headley scarce spoke for the rest of the evening, and the tears came into my old silly eyes, and Mr. Gray, who was before silent and awkward in a way which I tell Bessie she must cure him of, was made so happy by this pretty action of my lady's, that he talked away all the rest of the evening, and was the life of the company. Oh, Margaret Dawson, I sometimes wonder if you're the better off for leaving us. To be sure, you're with your brother, and blood is blood, but when I look at my lady and Mr. Gray, for all they're so different, and I would not change places with any in England. Alas, alas, I never saw my dear lady again. She died in 1814, and Mr. Gray did not long survive her, as I dare say you know. The Reverend Henry Gregson is now vicar of Hanbury, and his wife is the daughter of Mr. Gray and Miss Bessie. End of chapter 14. Recording by Adina Owen.
End of My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell.